in Lord of the Rings. I just couldn't care less about Hobbiton. The hobbits themselves, just it's like, yeah, they're my cousins. I get it.
You're not into the gossipy bullshit politics of the Shire?
Yeah. Right.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Eliot.
I'm Jordan.
And before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. If you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia, where if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining us. Today we are talking about world building. This is actually going to be the first in a couple, possibly 3 episode stretch where we talk about world building. I think it's pretty up in the air how long exactly we'll be talking about this, but this is the first in the series. Hopefully the series will come out one after the other. But today we are going to be talking about specifically the top-down perspective of doing world building. And for reference, from the Wikipedia on world building, in the top-down approach, the designer first creates a general overview of the world, determining broad characteristics such as the world's inhabitants, technology level, major geographic features, climate, and history. And from there, they develop the rest of the world in increasing detail. This approach might involve creation of the world's basics, followed by such levels as continents, civilizations, nations, cities, and towns. A world constructed from the top down tends to be well integrated, with individual components fitting together appropriately. It can, however, require considerable work before enough detail is completed for the setting to be useful.
Listening to that, the first thing that pops into my mind was a question I have for you, Jordan. Looking back on all our, times role-playing over the ages, I can't think of a time that you've actually world-built in the way that that a lot of people that I know of in like a D&D world or whatever. I know that a lot of the games that we've played, you run in other people's creations. Have you ever just started from scratch with the world before?
Yeah, a couple times. Never gets very far, so I run other stuff. I started way back when running, adventures in Middle Earth. So that's, obviously well established. But then not long after I started trying to make my own shit, it's just fairly exhausting to do, but it's fun and I've done it. And I've got, files and files of a couple of different worlds that I've never ran for very long. I've run like one-shots and stuff, but it's hard to get player buy-in if they don't already have an attachment to the universe and don't already have expectations about how things will play and, what the feel is and that kind of thing. You know what I mean?
I do.
Well, I would argue that any time that somebody is running a game, they are doing world building. They may not be starting with the world from scratch, but they are, in fact, world building. If you're using a pre-established setting, then all of the top-level stuff, all of the macro stuff is already taken care for you. And so then you are stuck with creating a lot of the nitty-gritty details, or you are just stuck with creating a particular location and integrating that with the world at large. So I want to clarify that in my view, world building is always something that a GM is doing, even if they're just planning out just one session. That session does include world building because you're adding something to what has already been written down by the world, whether or not you were the one who originally wrote down the preliminary stuff for that setting.
That's true. I've made up a ton of planets for Star Wars games and stuff. When I ran Fallout, I ran it in a part of the United States that, to my knowledge, has never been in Fallout game before. And yeah, when we've done like Aliens type games and stuff like that, Whole New Planets, but that's a little easier though when you're hopping around different places and you can, have these little episodic like samples of a place. The whole like George R.R. Martin working out the, three-dimensional chess of the current political situation and how that's been impacted by 15 generations of conflict going back to whatever. Like, no, fuck all that.
See, I come at this, I think that's probably the majority of people's experiences when they come to a role-playing game. Maybe I'm wrong, but I come at it a little differently. The world building's my favorite part. The game for me is more an excuse to world build, kind of like, forcing yourself on a to-do list or something like that. I run games to keep myself interested in world building. And what's funny is that I find myself, like in the current game we're in, I really struggle when it comes to the micro level gameplay, the micro level building. The best thing I ever did was decide to run pre-gen modules and just nest them in my world, because it gives me kind of the best of both worlds. It lets me not have to, it lets my mind focus on the big picture stuff and create that just to my heart's content, but I'm not finding myself worrying too much about NPCs or storyline narrative as much, or dungeon creation. That's why I'm really kind of terrified that we're about to finish up the current module we're on and it's going to cut me loose into my world,
So, Eliot, whenever you were creating this this world, I've only ever heard you refer to it as Bastion, but I don't know if you have a name for the greater world at large. But like, what was the first step you did for deciding that you wanted to do this world?
Well, so in the way that so in my approach is that with fantasy, there's always some things you're trying to like ask yourself, and to me, one thing that I think D&D always kind of sidesteps is and takes for granted, and often when we get in the games, we don't fully, as modern people, get a sense of, is that, what's it like if you live in a world where there are gods that actually are, most of the time we run games in D&D that I've played in where it's like kind of like pagans. It's like everybody has a ancient Roman, ancient Greek kind of thought and feel about the world, because there are multiple gods and they kind of superimpose mythology on it. But that's where my first thought came from was, what would, in my case, it was like, what would ancient Greece or ancient Rome have been like if all the gods were actually real? Like, and they, gave magic to people, How would that actually change a world? What would it feel like to live in that world where it's not a mystery? I know the ancients actually believed it, but there was a really strong atheism streak in paganism. I mean, in my mind, there was always the philosopher side of things where, like the Aristotles, even the Platos, most of the great philosophers and thinkers of the ancient times, they started from obviously all this stuff is hogwash. So what's the world really about, But that was really the kernel that it grew out of. Ultimately, I decided to solve that problem by killing them. So all the gods are dead in my world, but that was what kind of got me thinking about making my own world.
Yeah, whenever we did, it's been, I don't know, a year or two now on this podcast where we did a couple of episodes where we did world building for a world. We sat down and on the recording, we created a setting to play in. We never actually got to play in the setting, but whenever we started thinking about it, I don't remember if there was a conscious decision. I didn't go back and listen to the episode, but we did go top down. We did go from the macro, the large, to the small, to the micro. We started talking about the cosmology first we decided if this was going to be a fantasy setting, which we did, and then we really went bonkers from there with the cosmology. And looking back, I feel like we went a little too bonkers with the high level stuff. And as we narrowed down, we kind of lost, well, I know I lost some steam for talking about it, for coming up with new things. And I know we were constrained on time because it ended up being a 2-part episode. And like 40 minutes of the first episode was just talking about this high level cosmology stuff that in the end of things just was not something that was really going to be pertinent to a man on the street, a character that the PCs would eventually be playing in this setting. So I feel like that's one of the things that if you're coming at it from, particularly from a fantasy realm, if you put a lot of your emphasis into the big picture, you might just run out of things to, you just might run out of steam for putting the implications of everything trickling out through. If you have a lot of time to create a setting, then you have the time to replenish that well of inspiration. But if you're coming at it from you're just trying to do it all in one big go, there is definitely fatigue that goes along with going from these really big ideas that you want to throw everything you can into every single idea, and then you go through it and you just end up having just a little bit less enthusiasm, a little less creativity in with each decision that you make, where if you can spread it out and, like I said, replenish your creative well, it can create a world that is just so foreign that it's hard to really root yourself in once it comes to actually playing in the setting.
I mean, I think that's what attracts me to the idea of world building in the first place. That's why really I enjoy that part more than most of the other parts of role playing. It's the attempt to make things feel authentically alien. You know, this reminds me of Tolkien. Like, I think I was delaying even saying that name because I feel like, you know, I think everyone's example, certainly Gary Gygax's example, because just like you had mentioned or Jordan had mentioned, you know, in doing some research for this particular podcast, I read a lot about Gary Gygax and those early, you know, the Greyhawks. Oh gosh, of course the name escapes me now, but there was another world that was ran in, but for the most part, they just ran in Middle Earth. That was their inspiration, and they were the bottom up. You know, D&D was essentially a bottom up creation in the way we're talking about it. You know, they weren't so much worried about the big picture world building. That's not where they got their kicks. They came from the wargaming side. They just took advantage of all the creative work that Tolkien had done, set it in Middle Earth, and then added their own content to create dungeons and bad guys and sub-realms, just enough to get by, and then they draped Tolkien on top of it for the exact reason like you're talking about. I remember when we first started my game, I had already decided to run the Phandelver module and just kind of place it in my world, and I was so thankful for it because, I mean, I've literally, in fits and starts, been generating content and revising content and new content. I mean, 10 years now I've been writing on this world just for fun and pastime, nothing serious. But I've got a pretty good amount of content built up in my head and on paper. It took Jordan maybe 2 minutes to talk me into a blank spot. You know what I mean?
What did I do?
Well, I had laid out a strangeness about the world. Like and something I still haven't perfectly addressed is it's lunar and its cycle. There's no sun and moon. It doesn't get light that way. So you were just asking me specific questions about night and day. And what I had imagined made sense in my head. Once I brought it to a player, it was immediately clear that I was like, this doesn't make any sense. I have to redraft this. Well, imagine building everything from scratch. Like the questions, I mean, the reason why I said Tolkien in the first place was the whole reason why Tolkien worked was because his amount of work on his world, all he did was, when he was writing Lord of the Rings, he would reference stories and facts about the world in passing. And at this stage, if you're a big Tolkien fan, you've read the Silmarillion, it's like it's like an Easter egg whenever, Galadriel mentions the fall of Gondolin. But if you're just coming to the story, it just creates this alienness, this richness that creates the illusion that there's a depth to the world,
Mm-hmm.
That I think world building, that's what world building does. When it's done well, that's all it does. It's not meant to, if not, then you run a risk of something that I'd like you guys to talk about your experiences with. Have you ever been in that world where the DM was just so proud of his precious that it took no time at all to realize this world has nothing to do with me, and I'm just sitting here being taken on a tour, and isn't that the least fun game you can play in?
I will second that. Yes, that is one of the least fun worlds you can play in.
I'll third it.
I will say that I've got an analogy for kind of like how, like, the biggest fault in top-down world creation. Back a few years ago, I was playing a Dark Sun game online using a program called Map Tool. And the awesome thing about Map Tool was you can make literally maps as big as you wanted. So what I did was I found online the highest resolution picture I could find of the map of Athos, the world of Dark Sun. And I set that to scale for the world. Whenever you were scaled all the way out, it looked pretty cool that you could then zoom in and go down. Like, my idea was to populate it so that whenever we wanted to go to individual scale, like going to a map, I would literally just zoom in on the map down to wherever it was, and then I would put another smaller map down there for where we would fight. Well, I like I said, I found the biggest map I could, the highest resolution map that I could. But it did not take long of zooming in before everything was just blank. It was just a monotonous color, like where a single pixel would, on the larger map, would end up being like hundreds of feet across in the individual scale map. So it was impossible to find anything. And there was nothing there. You couldn't see anything because you could only see the big picture things. You couldn't see, like, if you were in a forest, yeah, it was a shade of green in the area where you were in, but there was nothing there. And that's kind of how top-down world building goes, is if you just have that beautiful picture of the map, it looks awesome. But then once you zoom in, you lose any of the detail. You lose it. It just becomes a blank slate where you then have to go and create more so that you can zoom in a little bit more and then create more, and then zoom in a little bit more and create more, so that you're creating this narrowing picture as you go down. And that's where I said, like, earlier about losing steam, losing the creative energy. It takes a lot in order to do that. And that's all front loaded in the game. You have to do all of this prep before session 1, before the players enter into the world, or else they get into a vast, beautiful world that is empty.
That's the pitfall.
That's an interesting problem you bring up, Clayton, about the problem of scale in role-playing worlds. I've seen this a bunch of times, and I don't know that that I've ever seen a really good solution for it, but there is like this breakdown between the world map and the tactical map that is scaled to like a couple of buildings, a street or whatever. But like I've yet to see a good way of handling, let's call it the regional scale, like sort of horizon to horizon, kind of handling things. And you see this come up in modern games a lot. If somebody's got like a long range sniper rifle, or if someone's got like aircraft, or if there's a car chase, you see this in fantasy stuff. If there's like, 2 ships on the open ocean, like pursuing each other, things like that, like stuff that's not mini scale and it's not world map scale. It's in between. And it sits right at the cliff between world design and game design. And by game design, I mean like the actual, numerical mechanics and the gameplay layout of what the players are actually going to be doing with their pieces and their powers and so on. I think that's the intermediary band of game has a lot of potential there, but I've never seen it done well, and I'm not sure that the solutions that you put in there would work very much like tabletop role-playing games do. Like, that's where you get into things like army unit rules and stuff like that, like we did for Savage Worlds and that kind of stuff. I think that gets into almost a board game territory at that point.
I want to shout out a really great podcast at this point to illustrate something that your conversations just sparked in my mind. It's called Writing Excuses. It's hosted by Brandon Sanderson and some of his friends. And if you don't know, Brandon Sanderson was the lucky guy who was tasked to finish Wheel of Time after Robert Jordan died. Not a fan myself. Not a not fan, but
he was also an accomplished writer on his own before that.
Absolutely. Check out Mistborn. I've never read any of. I've read a couple of the Wheel of Time's books, and I'm sure I'll get back to it eventually. But it didn't pull me in like so many before. But Mistborn of his is one that I've read. I'm about to finish it, actually. I'm listening to it right now. It's really good. He's a good author. He's an accomplished author. But that makes my point, is that if you're approaching a world in your mind that you want to play in D&D, one thing I've learned over the years, and especially now having ran in a big sandbox module like Ravenloft is so good, it's that those are two really different things. And if your world creation starts with like mine did with a cosmology, but mine grew really quick. The reason why my world's had such long legs is that I've just, every time I've gotten the juice to make a world again, I just continue to iterate the world I already have. You know what I mean? I just have decided a long time ago, it's better to work on one thing and make ideas fit into it than just have a bunch of different loose end ideas. That's my approach. But looking back on it, my world that I'm building really isn't suited it doesn't put the role-playing game first. Like you were saying, Jordan, and you started, Clayton, if you're looking to top-down world build, it's fine to have an idea about cosmology. I think you kind of have to work out how does magic work. I personally don't think there's anything wrong with skinning, especially D&D 5e. If you're playing that, you can skin any cosmology on top of it, adopt the Norse myths, just take the Greyhawk world if you want to. But what really matters in my opinion, as a player is it's the geography. You know, that's what pulls me in, because that's where my character is going to be moving. That's what's going to give me the sense of depth. Is, where does my character live? Where are they from? How does it relate? And so many of the times people start with, that's how I certainly did, is I started with a big map. I like to make maps. It's its own hobby of mine. I just like to draw maps. So of course, when I made my world, I just pulled out this gigantic continent, and I was like, gee, I wonder what lives here, We've had millions of years of evolution to tell the story of our world. One person can't fill all that space. Starting off with a very small polity, I think, is the first best step to world creating kind of in a top-down manner, that can make your game get that sense of depth and reality that the players will enjoy, but still give them the content to where they have their own agency in it. And if I were to decide I'm going to make my own module, I would highly recommend everybody read the Ravenloft module set, if for no other reason than just to see a system or see something that's done it well, because you could do that, I think. Make a very small kingdom or a couple of kingdoms, embed some wilderness, and then start thinking about game stuff, for the player's sake. Where's the dragons? Where are quests? What quests do I want to sprinkle in here? What dungeons do I want to put in here? And then build storyline around that. Because if you're just geeking out about world building in general, and then you decide to drop your players into it, what you're really doing is you're creating a fantasy world and you're just wanting to use your players as an excuse to talk about it.
Yep.
And that gets back to that not fun part.
I would also say that if you're wanting to do world building, there are a couple of games, board games especially, where the entire point of the game is world building. Before we ran our Abena game in Savage Worlds, we played the a rule set I found online more than 15 years ago called Dawn of Worlds, and that rule set is entirely about world creation. It's designed so that you and the other players basically take on the role of gods, and from scratch you create the world. You first create the terrain, the geography, the climate, then you carve out the different races that exist in this world. It's assumed to be a fantasy world. Then you create the political states, and then you slowly create the not the political states. You create a few cultures, and then you create basically the history as the political states come into being in the world. I felt like it was a really good resource. I think most of the players really enjoyed going through that for world creation, because it was one of those cases where we had a world that was brand new to everybody, because we literally created it ourselves, and all the players had buy-in for playing in that world because everybody owned a piece of the world. Another game that I have played, a board game called Small World, is really good for creating particularly empires in a fantasy world. The game has mechanics where you are playing as a particular nation state, and it has mechanics built into it so that your civilization that you're playing can go into decline and no longer exist, and then you come like a new civilization rises up that you play as. So it really creates a more dynamic world where there is that ancient history where great empires once existed but no longer exist.
I mean, yeah, there's nothing wrong, I don't guess, with, if you're like an aspiring writer and you love fantasy and you just want another way to world build, that's, for me, that's the reason why. I've written like 100 words 100 times that I've left on the floor, but, on my bucket list is to write, short stories and novels and things like that. And, if you want to drop your players into the world that you've already created and want to kind of show it off a little bit, I think that's fine. But just so often when you do that you lose track of your players and you take away their agency. Two examples that, in my experience, that's done this really well, coming at it from different. I had a friend once who he just made a large city, but and so what was going on? Basically, there was no content beyond the city, and I'm not sure how he pulled that off. I think he just said that to us up front, and it is that he wanted the players to have a sandbox experience, but in order to get around the problems we're talking about, he just said, I've made this big city. If you want to leave the city, you can. It's like a desert, and there's nothing out there. So have fun. Or you can be in this city. But then he built that city up, and it was a big town, to excruciatingly minute detail. And he took the vastness out of it. And that was a hell of a lot of fun. Because you do want to have agency in a game, but we also as players have this double standard, is that we don't ever want I think sometimes in the back of our heads we kind of challenge our DMs and see, do you have to make this one up as far as NPCs go? Did I go off the board a little bit? I think everybody notices when the DM goes off the board or goes off grid. And it's not a gotcha moment, but sometimes you've got your DM on their heels whenever they're like having to look for their list of character names or whatever. So the more that you can interact, more that a player, I think, can interact with a pre-made NPC, the more enjoyable it is for that player, because they know that NPC has some depth. But they shouldn't have as much depth as the PC themselves. But the other example I want to mention before I ask your all's thoughts is There was a module, I've been trying to find it while you talk, Clayton, that Pathfinder made in the early days. I just cannot find the name of this module, but I read it a million times and never got a chance to run it. I never owned it. I worked at a game shop when I was a kid, and I just read it a million times there, but I never bought it. And that was the whole premise was kind of like that board game that you said. The whole premise of the game was that it was set in this small world of the Pathfinder world, like a region, but the players were sent off to quest into this wilderness land that was kind of in the process of being, it was like a frontier that multiple regions were competing over to settle. And that was the whole point of the game, was it created rules and built it into the module that the players built a town. And then the town became a city, and then the city became a region, and next thing you know, the players started off by being sent out into the wilderness, and it even had little chits and stuff where you built the map too, so it wasn't even like, even the map making was not scripted, and the players literally did it. It gave you NPCs, and it helped you generate random NPCs to put in the world, and the idea was that the players would rise to be the champions of this city region that they ultimately created themselves. And I thought that was it was a really cool looking module. I don't know how it would have played out itself, but it definitely looked like it was a cool idea to have the players guide the content creation. But that's a little bottom up from compared to what we're talking about. Maybe we'll talk about that more in next episode.
I think I prefer a setting to play in that is one person's vision over something that has accumulated over time, like Faerun, or has been thrown together as a committee, like with Abena. I think I like playing in a setting where this is somebody's artistic expression. This is someone's, inspiration here, and everything there is done with intent. Though I had fun playing Abena, because I was playing with friends and, doing cool stuff. As far as a setting goes, it was very haphazard, and I also didn't like that I was there for the creation for all of it, because I felt like that pretty much, blew up a lot of the mystery. I know what's over the horizon because I was there when such and such designed that continent. And, with Faerun, like, that place is a mess. I mean, every country feels like it's just kind of been shoehorned in from some other place. And so it's just this gigantic clusterfuck of ideas all smashed into one world, and how that works has never really been clear to me. But I don't know. I mean, it was fun to have the experience of like building a world collectively as a group, but I think the end product of it was just kind of like zany and didn't really suit any kind of like serious campaign very well, in my opinion. That's just me though.
Well, I echo a lot of what you're saying. I've done Dawn of Worlds a few times, including that time, and the thing you're talking about, the like having a coherent vision, is definitely something that has come up every single time I've played it, where it does have a haphazard manner or a haphazard feel to it, and there's always at least one player who has a very different idea of what is cool and appropriate for this setting that you are creating, and you will have the one player who decides to make the race that is small blue hedgehogs that move really fast so that nobody can see them, or you have the player who creates the continent where none of the laws of physics work properly, and there is a circle of there is literally a big rolling ball that perpetually rolls around on this continent in perpetuity because the laws of physics are fucked up there. And whenever I've been a participant in the world creation like that, I just stare at the other player and I'm like, why are you doing this to us?
See, but it can, and maybe that's more of a DM play style, because I have 100% played in games where, it seems like it should make sense. We're not playing in a world that I'm familiar with, which, even if someone doesn't generate the whole world, if you're just not familiar with it, I think that gets at the kind of the mystery of it, Jordan, that you were talking about. I can remember when I played in my very first game, it was ran by someone who's very familiar with the Michael Moorcock Elric series, and so he was playing in that world, but I knew nothing about it. So it created that, I had that mystery, that sense of discovery that you want, and the DM played it flawlessly. And it wasn't, and the players and his story was front and center, but because he knew how to work in all these references to the Purple Towns and all that stuff, referenced history from the book series, it felt like a deep world. And I think that's really that's the butter zone. It's when the players are in the driver's seat, they have full agency, they feel like active and influential participants in the world, but there's also depth around every corner. But then on the other hand, I've also played in worlds where people are so in love with foreign systems, foreign worlds, that they're there more to showcase the world to you, and you can still fall into that same trap of having the players watch a movie that you're showing to them, where they're fairly inconsequential, and it not even be the world you made. So maybe that's more a DM type than a fault of how you world build.
Well, there's definitely people who do that, and there's also people who don't go any deeper than that. They paint with broad strokes, and they never put any detail. They never put anything that is there for the player characters to interact with. I've been in a game where there was, like, the world building was really good, but beyond the world building, there were no people there for my character to interact with. There was no adventure. There were things going on in the world, but there wasn't an adventure for my character to go on. Like what I was saying about the, like, zooming in and just having a blank slate, just having a featureless void. With top down, there's so much work that goes into it that, like, especially before the first session. And that, I think that's the biggest flaw with the top down, that, I've done top down most of my GMing career. It's how I've made most of my settings. It's how I've run most of the settings that I've played in, existing worlds. Basically the top down perspective. And I'm getting burnt out on world creation. It's not the act of world creating that burns me out. It's that I just run out of steam when it comes down to making something fun for the players.
Exactly. And that's why it has to be super intentional that and it maybe if you say you have a world in your back pocket and you really love the world you've made and you've obsessed over it and you just really want to run your role-playing game in it, maybe just because that's why you're building it in the first place, or maybe it's like for other creative things that you want to test drive some NPCs or whatever. I know that in writing excuses, I think I meant to bring, I think that was the whole point I didn't actually make when I mentioned them the first time, was they've done seasons and seasons on world building. I mean, if you really, as a creative person in general, if you want to get your juices going, go listen to that podcast. It's really good. But it's so important to keep in mind that if you're wanting to do a good role-playing game, you need to generate that, why, like I'm looking at our show notes, keep looking at cosmology, and what attracted me to it in the first place is I wanted to create my own cosmology. In the back of the book, there's a really great series that has a great audiobook called, The Gods of Pagana. If you're into the Silmarillion or the Bible, which not many people are, I've learned, but, you can really tell that J.R.R. Tolkien took some P's and Q's from Lord Dunsany, because he created a whole book about it. If you want to create myths, that's great. But that's one thing I ran into. It's like, well, how do they actually fit in the world's magic system? What are their domains? How am I going to give magic to these players? Am I going to recreate the magic system too? I think Tracy Hickman? Jordan? Margaret Wise?
Mm-hmm.
That's how they approached it. They fiddled with the magic system itself, and so part of the the reason why it made sense that they made up their own cosmology is because it actually had an in-game effect. It changed the magic system from the foundation a little bit. Made it cool to be a different type of wizard or a different type of cleric. But, at a certain point, ask yourself, why am I not just adapting? Why am I not just reskinning, if I need to, the other gods and calling it a day? Am I really going to add something new here? Because if you're not going to add something new for your players to experience, you probably shouldn't be dwelling too much on it. And if you really are compelled to change a cosmology up significantly, it really ought to enhance the game for the players. And there needs to be that stuff written in. And that's tough. It's time consuming. I could see why you get burnt out.
I also think it's a mistake to, sort of along these lines as well, to try to get too weird in your game design. This sort of goes back to what we were talking about with designing as a committee, but like individuals can do this all the time. If it might sound like a good idea in your head, but like if you're not referencing back to, cultures and history and, normal touchstones that a modern player today would understand, and you're instead just creating this thing from whole cloth that is unlike anything that we have any experience with, or is some bizarre amalgamation of a bunch of things that we do have experience with, you're asking a lot of mental burden out of your players to keep track of like what all these different countries are like, or what the magic's like, or, blah, blah, blah. Like it might seem interesting to, go off in some weird experimental direction with stuff and be like, well, how does that play out? Maybe it works out, maybe it doesn't. But you can only get away with that so many times. You could have one strange society if your whole game is going to take place in that one society. But like you mentioned Michael Moorcock, and as much as I love the Young Kingdoms, when you really read about his descriptions of people from the different kingdoms within the Young Kingdoms, they're weird. They're very weird. Every one of them is weird. And there's no place that's like, this is Rome. This is France in the 1400s. This is, Norman England. They're kind of like that, but then they're also walking around with like, purple and yellow striped pants and, bells on their shoes and just weird Moorcock shit. So it's what my brain does when I look at stuff like that is just kind of ignore the differences altogether. Like, this is the name of a place, and if I need to know something about it, then I'll look it up. But you don't have like a vibrant, living, like, grokking of the setting in the way that you would if you looked at a map of Europe from, 1400, and you kind of got an idea of what people from each spot are probably more or less like. You know what I mean?
What do you guys think about this idea? This is something I've been tinkering around with in my game, because I'm very much feeling all these challenges. Because as we wrap up Strahd, the goal for me was to give myself some time to create, to challenge myself to kind of live up to these things, to have a world that's immersive yet at the same time leads to adventure, right? Clayton, kind of really is what we're getting at here, an adventurous D&D game. And one thing that I don't think it's bad to have a map. I think it's important, and if you're going to top-down build, to have a map. It doesn't have to be a whole continent, but it should certainly encompass every corner of where you're going to let your players go. And by God, if you put that boundary up, it needs to be the world literally falls off there. You know what I mean? Because you can be guaranteed that if you say in that direction is where unknown is, your players are going to gravitate there just for curiosity's sake.
That's exactly what we did. We tried to drive a flying city off the edge of the world.
Yeah.
just to see what happens.
To see what happens. You're daring your players to do it. So you either make it super small with impenetrable barriers, but ultimately too, part of that should be an indictment on your content. In the game that I played where we were in that big city, we played 10 or 12 sessions. Never even once wanted to go outside the world, because he allowed my character to have complete agency, stakes. My character was a wizard, but he didn't even really see himself as a wizard. I was a businessman, I ran a business. That was it. That was my character. And sure enough, silence led me to invest in the world because he knew where everything was. He knew where all the plot hooks were. He knew all the NPCs in the world. He said, what are you going to do? And I rooted my character in the world because he let me. But if you do have an adventurous party, and this kind of gets, I'm being long-winded, I need to get back to my point. I'm thinking about not giving you guys any more maps. I've got maps. I've got lots of maps. I like making maps. But why would you have maps? Why would a party have a map? If a party has a map, it gives them those blank spots to gravitate towards. It also can sometimes break the spell. And thinking back to the Middle Ages, yes, your players are adventurers, and that naturally makes them leveled heroes, and leveled heroes would have access to wealth and stuff. But even then, in the Middle Ages, expansive maps were really rare, really expensive, and usually wrong. So what do you guys think about that as a story device? Does that sound like a pain in the butt? Does that sound like a limiting factor for fun, or could not having necessarily the DM give you, here's a world map, guys, go plunder?
I think maps should be items. I think that's absolutely right. And I was thinking about an Elric story that I was just reading the other day, where he gets a map from some random person in a seaside bar at some harbor town, and thinks he's, on the track of whatever it was he was after. And the map turns out to just be totally fucking wrong. And then that, launches him into another adventure. But that kind of shit, that's legit. And man, the more goofy the map looks, the better. I mean, I love looking at old maps from the Middle Ages, and sometimes you gotta turn them over a couple times to even tell which way they're meant to be oriented. But
map making is hard.
That's bad.
Not on a creative side, an actual, that is a huge human achievement.
Sure.
To have figured out how to make a accurate, reliable map. And once you start going past a county, I remember my dad used to have a map of our Greenup County where I grew up in, and it was a topographical map, and it showed all the, it was complex. And it was just a couple, I don't know, a couple hundred square. I'm sure I got that totally wrong, but, Greenup County is a small place. But if you just looked at that map and had all the little cities, all the little towns, names of all the hollows and main roads, I mean, you could adventure in a map like that to level 20. And if the hooks are good and the content within it is good and you don't feel particularly compelled to leave, then you could really dial in, and I'm thinking handing over the world map, I guess, is maybe what I'm talking about. I think is a really bad idea to your players.
I agree. I mean, from a military perspective, from a mercantile perspective, accurate maps are probably the most valuable thing you can imagine. And even just fragments of the world mapped accurately are of enormous value. And I imagine that they would be protected, that there would be, just like we saw in the Age of Exploration, rich people would fund expeditions just to go fucking map the goddamn coastline and bring back, some cartography. That's an adventure on its own. So, yeah, I think that's a cool dimension of it.
I had, talking of ideas, one of the things, keeping in mind your world setting is key. What's going to be fun. I know Apocalyptia, whenever you first sent me those rules and I was reading it over it, and you had a lot of random generation, there was so much randomness built into the game. I thought it would be fun to grid out a map that was just for the DM, and it was just random. All I did was take a grid paper, and I think you had something built into the game where it's certain areas have a higher lethality or a more likely chance to have bad things happen to you. And the whole game was going to be at least the game that I had in my mind that would be fun to run would be like the goal of the party is just to get to a big city to go recover a generator or something. Like there's this little group of people, and all I did was map it out, and all I did was make like this area is really lethal, and then around it is a less lethal area, and then there's a safe area, and it was going to be just, hey, get through it. And, next thing you know, the players would just wander down the road for a while and it would be perfectly safe, and then content would create itself. That stuff really scares me, though. Like, that's another thing that puts me off not running off somebody else's script when it comes to the bottom-up approach, which I'm bad at. I'm bad at the bottom-up part of the game, or world design, is random encounters scare the crap out of me.
Why?
How do you guys feel about that stuff?
Why do they scare the crap out of you first, though?
Well, they're really slow. They can easily be unbalanced, and they often don't matter in the big picture of this storyline.
Oh, you just mean particularly random combat encounters like D6 goblins or whatever the fuck.
Those, but then, systems that really integrate those into... I feel like your system in Apocalyptia, random encounters and randomness, random charts, and generating a lot of content on the fly is something that you had it intended, and you made it real streamlined to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still, something about it, still, the idea of not having control over every encounter, and every encounter has a reason. Why would you, like, not to go on a diatribe, I've been talking a while, but I have to tell this story. There was one time I played in a guy's game, and it was like his Precious, one of those, and we had a hard time because we couldn't wrap our head around this foreign, he had foreign rules, he had laws, he had a system of governance all in place, and we had no clue. And I remember we had a random encounter on a road with a sheriff or guards, and they asked us for our identification. Well, he didn't build in that we would or would not have identification. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember what the story was. I think maybe I was a thief, so I'd maybe had it written into my background that I was like an outlaw. Mm-hmm. So I refused. And he just owned us. Like, mm-hmm. And it turned the entire party against me because everybody else just presented their papers, and I felt like I had a reason not to. And he made me feel like a dummy because unbeknownst to me, like, I don't know, his sheriffs were really like high level. So they were like basically super level adventurers. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that. And I don't know, that diatribe that was an example of a random encounter that should have meant nothing to the DM. It meant nothing to our game or our adventure. And yet we spent 2 hours dealing with it, and it caused a lot of internal party strife.
Yeah, random encounters that are like literally random and they don't have anything that tie into the world itself. Those are a major problem. But to tie it back to top-down world creation, like one thing that I like to do is I like to do at least a sketch of the history of the world and maybe of a particular region, and I use that for drawing inspiration whenever I get those random encounters. For instance, in my Thursday game, I've been relying on random encounters as player characters just go out into the world, but I don't have just random encounters of, okay, this is one group of people or monsters, this is another group of people or monsters that you can encounter. You can also encounter monuments, just location, like special locations, magical effects, things like that. And I've been able to have them be just randomly come up, but where I have this very broad history, I am able to, on the fly, just kind of tie things together so that they make some sort of sense in the world. Like, if you've got these high level concepts taken care of, you have the ideas for them, it makes coming up with shit on the spot a lot easier because you have a frame of reference. Okay, this particular region where they were in 2,000 years ago, this place was conquered by an equivalent of Greek civilization. So the characters, I've randomly rolled that there is a tomb here, so it logically makes sense that the like all of the skeletons and things that are inside would be wearing Greco-Roman era armor and weapons.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how I got so off topic with that, but I guess the reason why, it's just when you world build from the top down, like you said, you quickly run out of content, or your players will run off grid, and you're like, oh no, what do I do now? And I feel like it pulls you into the kind of the scrambling mode. Scrambling mode is death for a game. Scrambling mode is no fun for anyone, and that's the risk you run.
That's why I built all those tools into Apocalyptia, because the world itself is pretty well established. It's Earth after some fucked up shit goes down. And what the details are of how that's going on, there probably aren't nations anymore. There probably aren't, like, you know, big political struggles happening or anything like that. Whatever's going on is going to be on a local scale kind of thing. So all the material, all the generation engines involved are for creating encounters with people who are representative of different factions that I felt would be like sort of natural organizing structures that, you know, when society breaks down to that level of, you know, sort of tribal again, what are the sorts of groups that you're likely to see? And the idea there is not that this is just your wandering monster table. It's that these are people. These people have descriptions in the book of, you know, what they're about, what kind of stuff they might need, what their general orientation might be towards other people, if they're agreeable, if they're aggressive, whatever. And there's ways to handle almost all of them. Like there's only a couple that are like, you know, psycho, cannibal, nut jobs. And so it's meant to be story seeds more than it is just filler while the DM compensates for not having done any work that week. So that's what I was going with that. There's enough like supporting structure around it, or at least the goal is that that a random encounter represents another step in the story and an opportunity to introduce another faction or some more characters or whatever it is, and flesh out the world a little more so that it's not just a bleak, empty wasteland, that there are people there that you might care about or have to deal with in some way.
We haven't really touched at all on history, and I'm sure we're getting close to time. I'd really like to know what's your all's approach to, well, I guess in Apocalyptia, human history is the big chunk of it, but when you're completely generating history, you know, what's that been like for you guys when you're doing it from scratch?
Well, I was about to say, you brought up the whole situation of needing papers on the road, and you, Eliot, didn't know that was a thing your character needed. I think that when you're creating a world that your character has been in for a while before you start playing it, the DM has a responsibility to create some body of common knowledge that everybody's going to have, and then you might also want to tailor specific knowledge that character is going to have because of their background that maybe some of the other characters share, maybe they don't. But you shouldn't just drop people in the middle of an alien world and expect them to, you know, operate as if they know what the fuck's going on. And it doesn't make any sense that they'd be, you know, wide-eyed yokels learning everything as if they're toddlers when they've grown up in that place.
Right. Yeah, I feel like in my case, I'm going to have to backtrack a little bit because I feel like that was one thing. I gave everybody a little bit of a little bit of knowledge about where they were from, but there are parts of the world I've completely generated since you guys went in, and so like I feel like that is a really important part, and especially if you can make the puzzle pieces fit. Like one person's from one region, they know more about that region than the other, so it's like they can kind of share information to make it feel more real. But what about you, Clayton? I'm curious to know how deep do you go into your histories whenever you create a world from scratch?
Whenever I do it from scratch, like the further back in history, the broader strokes I use. Like anything that is more than a couple of 100 years ago. Whenever I describe events, I'm talking like major events, like, okay, there was this great empire that existed from 1,500 years ago to 500 years ago, and then that empire fell due to barbarians. And then immediately following that, the groups that the current kingdoms basically came into formation, and then I kind of go into a little bit about just kind of the different types of people who inhabited the different areas. And then as the timeline gets closer and closer to when the start date of the campaign starts, I get more and more granular as I approach the present day. And I get much more focused on the particular area that the player characters are going to be in that particular, usually at the start of the game. And as the game progresses, I might add some bits and pieces to the history, but I'm not going to be writing anywhere near as much of the history as the campaign goes on as I did at the very onset of whenever I was getting ready to run the game initially.
I think that makes sense. That's kind of the same process I've had. I know that with me personally, where my world's so long running, typically the world grows as my interest grows in history. So if I'm bad about destroying things. So it's like there was a time I was really into Roman history. So originally this world was basically a knockoff of ancient Rome. And then I got into the fall of Rome and more the rise of the Franks and Europe, in the Middle Ages. So of course there was a cataclysm, and now over top of it was built a medieval world, and since then that world's been destroyed too. But that's something that I think can be key in immersion is if you treat each part of your history with equal interest, you're going to get to when the players are, and it's going to be just as thin as the early history is. So some ideas you just kind of got to give up on.
Don't be afraid to pull a Elder Scrolls as far as like running your campaign, especially if you're running it multiple times. Like each one of the Elder Scrolls games, not only do they take place in another location on the big map, but they're literally taking place hundreds of years after each other.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And, that can create, over time, that's kind of the idea. I think that's been true. That's why Faerun is so unbelievably complex and convoluted, is not only has it grown over the years from the mind of its creator, but if I'm not mistaken, the person who even began the world hasn't even been the one that generated the majority of the content in it. It's mostly been a group project in the 80s and the 90s. Mostly the 80s, right? Wasn't that the main D&D published world that lots of writers, contributed to?
Yeah, it's sort of been the default one definitely through the 90s and even through 3rd edition. Like, Faerun was the most fleshed out setting that I remember. So,
have you ever taken a notion to do anything more? Like, I know that with me, one of my big problems is I don't know if I'm trying to write stories or if I'm trying to run a game in my worlds, especially this world in here. Has that been a tripping point for any of you guys? You ever any armchair or would-be authors?
I think that's probably why I haven't run much in my world. Like when I've come up with a world and want to run it, I'll take a couple weeks or a couple months or sometimes a few years and be thinking about, a setting. And I still got several that I come back to from time to time. But every time I try to think okay, what the fuck are the players actually going to do? It's like, wait a second. No, this is just a creative, masturbatory exercise in my mind. I'm not making a game here. I'm just making a place. So that's what's always turned me off from running a brand new world. And I think being honest with yourself about what exactly it is that you're making and who it's for is important here.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm the same way. I have a setting that I have been working on for nearly 20 years, off and on, just little bits here, little bits there. And it's a setting I love, but it's a setting I will probably never run for a group because I don't think anyone else would give a shit about all of the work I've put into it and the intricacies of the world that I have put out or that I have created. I think that's a bitter pill that any game master or any creator just needs to swallow when it comes to doing this game, is that if you put all this work into the game, your players probably aren't going, not probably, your players are not going to be as enthusiastic about it as you are, especially if it's something you're coming up with whole cloth. The players have no buy-in. They might have a little bit that you've been able to tell them, but you're not going to be able to just sit there and you're not going to be able to sit there and expand on the intricacies of this world for hours on end, because nobody wants to do that. Most players can't be bothered to read a one-page summary of a setting, let alone sit there and listen to someone ramble on and on and on about their setting.
God,
Wait a minute.
So boring.
Wait a minute. So you're telling me that the 3-page lyrical poem that I've written to begin the second half of this campaign, that's not going to be engaging when I sit and ring it? I've already recorded. I've put it to music and shit.
No.
And that's probably why nobody really likes the Silmarillion, but they love the Lord of the Rings, is because, you know, what was cool about the Lord of the Rings is that he didn't talk about the Silmarillion. It was little, you know, tidbits out of the mouth of the NPCs that just helped further the story along. It made it feel a little more deep, but it didn't draw. I mean, at the end of the day, they were still focused on getting the ring to fucking Mordor. I don't know. I guess that's the Tra-la-la-la-lolly. What was that song the elves sang? That scene in the Hobbit seemed a little bit. A lot of people struggled getting through that one.
Yeah, if you make a cute little synopsis and get Leonard Nimoy to sing it to me in a jingle, then you got me hooked.
I got the reference.
I don't think Eliot did.
Oh, Bilbo,
You got it.
Baggins. Oh yeah, of course. Classic. Anybody who doesn't know that needs to go enjoy themselves. Treat yourself to a YouTube video or two from old Leonard Nimoy.
There will be a link in the show notes. So let's go ahead and move on to geek things now. Since we've already made one reference of a geek thing, the Ballad of Bilbo Baggins by Leonard Nimoy on YouTube. I've got another YouTube series or YouTube channel that I've been checking out recently relating to history. It's called Digital Hammurabi on YouTube. It's about Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East. It covers a wide variety of topics about the ancient Fertile Crescent and that particular area. The most recent things that they talk about are things that are in the Old Testament. So that's the kind of the era of history that they focus on for this YouTube series, and I'm learning a lot about it. I'm really enjoying it.
I've got 2 online tools that do a really large part of the world building automatically and randomly. The first one is called Asgar. Well, let me get the full name for it. Asgar's Fantasy Map Generator. You can find this at Asgar, azgaar.github.io. And every time you load the page, it just gives you a brand new fantasy map, like continent, like a world map. You can zoom way in on it, and it's basically like Google Maps in a fantasy world. And you can set all kinds of different filters, look at different things. You can edit it, change the names for stuff, move shit around. You can even get like a 3D model of the world, and you can save it in a bunch of different formats, and even load it back into the page and do work with it later. Like, it's a full-blown editor, and it's incredible. I mean, just how deep you can get, and it gives you like little stats about the individual cities as you click on them, like population and like, some of the features of the city, stuff like that. Real cool shit. And then if you want that city to be randomly generated, there's a link you can click that takes you to another open source web project. It's fantasycities dot, and I don't know how to pronounce this, watabou.ru. So this is some Russian thing. But it links directly to that, and it's the same thing for city scale stuff. And, you can randomize it, you can edit it, make it denser, make it, spread out, put roads, maps, city names, whatever you want. build a legend, set the scale to whatever you want it to be. It's pretty much everything you need right here for free out of these two open source projects. I mean, between these two things and, some Word documents, like, you pretty much have all the tools you need to build a pretty sophisticated fantasy setting, I think. So enjoy.
Ooh, that's a way to stay on topic. I failed at that one. I've really been enjoying a reality TV show lately called Forged in Fire.
Hell yeah.
I don't know if anybody's into that or not, or if it's been mentioned before, but I just found it on Netflix while I was working on maps or whatever, and I just kind of put it on in the background. It is so cool. I think anybody who's into fantasy and stuff, they like swords, they like knives. It's so funny how we talk about, how humans progress through the ages of bronze and metal and, an iron age and all this stuff. And yet that's something that we don't actually interact with anymore. How do you make things out of metal? If the world were to end tomorrow, we would be back in the Stone Age. But these guys know, and not only do they know, they can do it on short notice. And it's just really cool. It's a great show. They send them back to their homes. They make, I think the last one, they made a really awesome broadswords. And they bring them in, and then they put them through their paces and see who did it the best. And then they give them an on-the-spot challenge where they tell them, okay, this is what you're building, and you have 2 hours, go. And it's just really cool. I generally hate competition reality shows. They're usually something I just loathe. Forged in Fire, it's really good. Recommend.
All right, guys. Well, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Let's do it.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.